Hi, I'm Naomi. Welcome to my time-lapse video on how I've painted my latest painting, Emerald Stones. I love this piece and I hope you're going to enjoy watching how I've literally created it from start to finish using a combination of techniques called pouring with acrylic paint and also tissue paper built up in layers known as collage. I've been doing this technique for over 20 odd years now and I'm continually fascinated with how you get this amazing build up of depth and layers and colour and textures. I'm forever fascinated with the Granite Belt region and the amazing outcrops of rocks and formations and stones. So this is a place called Donnelly Castle and it's just magnificent and beautiful. So I really hope that you enjoy seeing how this progresses from nothing to this amazing piece. So stay with me now and I'm going to explain it in depth as we go along stage by stage. Thanks for watching. Right, welcome back. Well, the first area that we're starting with in the painting is the sky. Now, I'm using a pour technique where I put down medium and I'm dropping droplets of colour into it, and I wanted dots of rainbow colours very, very subtly in the sky as opposed to just a plain colour, because these rocks have this beautiful rainbow pattern. So I wanted that slightly echoed in the sky, but very subtly. So now you can see that I'm actually painting out with a very soft white blue tone just to make it look very glazed and distant with the colour being still there. Now you can see I'm beginning to layer up with layers of paper the rocks on either side of the chasm of where the sky is. Now I've chosen papers that have lots of rainbow stripes in them to try and echo this strata layering of colour that is actually in the rocks. It really is quite amazing when you see them, these beautiful colours that permeate. So I have to go through the whole base of the painting and build up with tissue paper in colours that I've chosen slightly echo the colours of the rock, but you'll see as we go along that the paint will cover to some degree this paper, but this paper build up in pieces now builds the base and the texture for the rock and the patterns that will begin to show through. And you can just see in the picture there a reference photo of the actual scene that I'm working to. So I'm trying to choose colours that do reflect the shapes and the patterns that are actually in the painting itself. And there's a bit of a closer look. You can see how the sky is reflecting those colours in just sort of dots and patterns. I thought it would be a nicer touch than just a plain blue or just a plain colour. So these colours are very vivid at the moment and they won't be as vivid at the end of the painting, but they will add a lot of depth and layer to the final piece that we're working on. So even though it's very quick here, me putting this paper down, it actually does take hours and hours. But I'm just building in the different shapes, the patterns of the rocks, very rough, very loose, because it will be progressed in layer by layer. So what we see here at this first pass isn't going to what you'll see actually at the end. And the beautiful thing about collage is that even if you put it down and you make a mistake and you think, oh no, that's not right, well great, you know what, you can just paint over it, you can just paper over it. So I love that this technique is so forgiving and versatile, and every piece is completely unique in how it's created. You cannot create the same piece twice. Myself, I could not even create this piece again just like this, even if I wanted to, because you'll never lay two pieces of paper down exactly the same way, in the same patterns and in the same shapes. So here I'm getting down to the bottom area of the rocks and just building that in and giving a bit of depth. So it's this amazing chasm which has got these beautiful emerald stairs and stones that lead up to this beautiful array of light with a tree hanging out over the canopy of the rocks. So almost there with my complete pass on getting all the paper down. So here's a bit of a close-up now look as we just scan down the painting, looking at the paper and the colours and the textures that I've put in as our first pass that is creating the base of the works. So I'm quite pleased with this. It's very colourful, it's interesting, and now it's given me my basic shapes and layouts on the painting. Right, I'm ready to start applying some paint now, and I've decided to start in the middle with the centre rocks and sort of work my way out. So I'm just beginning with tone and shape to form the rocks that are acting as staircases up through the gorge. You can see a little bit closer up, I'm trying to create a bit of form and shape with different colours and tones over the paper that I've already laid down. So it will take quite a few layers and a few passes to get the form really right. In this next stage, I'm using very transparent glazes to go over the areas of the rock where you can see a lot of the rainbow pattern and colour, mainly because I want that to show through the colours in the paper and some impression with the paint. So these colours are a little bit more subtle, and then I've started to block in with colour the rock area at the front, which is like a cutaway section in the granite. So there's quite a bit of paint that has to go over that to build up some depth and pattern. There's a lot of colour in it, even though it doesn't look that colourful. But when you look very closely at the granite, you can see actually a multitude of colours, and there's a lot of green moss on the rock as well. Next section, I've gone back to the rocks where I layered them in glazes. Now I'm using a palette knife to structure the patterns in the rock, adding deeper colours and lighter highlights, just to divide and define the tones and the shapes a little bit more that are now going to happen in this area. But still trying to keep the colours there, but they need more definition now. As you can see, they're beginning to take a bit more shape. As we move on to the next section, I'm going to start working on the stones that are leading up through the centre of the chasm. And up until now, they're just completely paper that you see, so I'm going to have to start to build more form and shape and colour over the sort of pretty green paper that I laid down. But I'm using glazes of greens and browns and limey tones to create more actual form. The rocks are starting to take a much more three-dimensional effect with the edges and the patterns and the shadows that are going on around them. So as we scan down the painting now, we can just see how they're beginning to take more three-dimensional form and the colours are beginning to develop together. I'm working now on the under area of the big rock with the shadow. I wasn't quite happy with the shape of that shadow, so I'm going to change that, but I also wanted to build up more tone and pattern in the shadow itself, which will get darkened down again a little bit later. And then I'm working on the lower rock here, again, building up more form and pattern into the rock that was just paper. 90% of the time I'm using is a palette knife, but occasionally you'll see that I'm using a paint brush to put in finer details. But I find that the palette knife gives you beautiful pattern and texture. So back to our big rock here, and I've decided to rework it again because as the colours and patterns change as I'm working through, I wasn't happy with that and I didn't feel it was getting the right effect. So more colour, more layers, going back to building the moss in the rock again. Now you can see that I've actually turned the painting upside down and I'm working on refining the layers and the stratas in the rocks and getting a little bit more pattern and colour and detail into this area. Easier to work on it upside down, but it's also a great thing to do when you actually visually want to look closer and see the patterns and the colours and the shapes more accurately, because our brain disassociates from what the image is and just begins to see what the actual colours and patterns are. Down in this lower left-hand corner, I'm reworking the area where the steps are leading up into the chasm, and again having to modulate and mould with tones and shades the contours of these rocks, because they're very subtle in a lot of ways, and as each stage of the painting changes you have to come back and modify another stage to work in balance with it. So I felt that this needed reworking again, and it only had one pass of paint, so this is probably our second or third pass at this stage. I've moved up to the next steps on the rock, and again modelling and creating more form and 3D realism in the rock. Have to look much more closely at the highlights and the shadows now to create that illusion that they are very 3D. So I've put in more highlights and I've put in more depth in the shadows, and the rocks are becoming sharper and more defined now as we ascend the emerald stone staircase. So finally at the top rocks, where they're quite small and I have to rework all the detail now, again really focusing on the highlights and the shadows and using a brush to define the shapes and the edges and the shadows in much more detail, just to get that definition of these small boulders all sitting together and getting the highlights and the shadows a little bit better balanced. Takes quite a few passes just to really refine all of that and to feel happy that everything's sitting in balance with each other, but it's slowly coming together. So now I'm putting in the sapling branch that is hanging out over the cliff edge. Finally, after all the sky and all the rocks around it are finished, it's quite a lovely little feature, which is what your eye is being drawn up to at the top of the rocks. Now I'm finally building up the greener tones, which is essentially moss on the rock, in light greens and dark greens, again to build up that 3D form and that illusion of reality, using my palette knife all the time just to give it a nice pattern and texture. Finally, we're at the end where I'm just filling in tiny little bits of details, finishing touches, just highlights and little bits of pieces here and there, adding a few more twigs and suggestions into the shadow under this big rock, and then just subtly removing them again just to suggest they're in the shadow but not dominating the picture. So here's my final painting, Emerald Stones. I do hope you really enjoyed watching me paint it, and I'd love it if you'd like to leave me some comments, some feedback, subscribe, watch some of my other videos to see how I've done all my other pieces, share with your friends. It's been great being able to explain this process to you, so thank you very much for taking the time to watch.